Okay, while we count down the last seconds, I can maybe introduce Shoken. So Shoken Kaneko was with us this summer virtually for a remote internship. He's from the University of Maryland, and he worked on a very exciting AI for Earth internship project on bird sounds. And with that, Shoken, please take it away.
Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for coming to my final internship presentation, and thank you, Hannes, for the introduction. So let's get started. Just briefly about the background. So there's a technique which is audio-based wildlife monitoring. This is an important technique used for purpose for conservation of animal species and ecosystems that the biologists use these kind of techniques. And Microsoft has an initiative in the AI for Earth project, which is concerned about these issues of conservation and sustainability. And we wanted to contribute to this field using these audio-based wildlife monitoring techniques by means of our expertise in acoustics and signal processing. So the particular problem that we're interested in is bird localization in forests using distributed microphone arrays. And our collaborators, Professor Justin Kitzis, who is in the University of Pittsburgh, his research group is planning to deploy this kind of distributed microphone array in a forest, which has about 20 by 20 microphones, so 400 or about 400 microphones, which would cover, in the largest case, a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer forest. So the challenges in this kind of localization problem is following. So first of all, we are interested in these forests. So the acoustics of the forest can be highly reverberant, which may harm the performance of the localization algorithm. And it could be also very noisy because of other animals in the forest or wind noise and rain, these kind of natural noise sources. And then we also have measurement errors, which are often maybe ignored, but we have to live with them. So we could have, we will have synchronization error because the signals of these distributed array, distributed channels will be synchronized using the GPS clock. And there is a certain amount of synchronization error. And also we have to deal with the positional ambiguity of the microphones. So it is not possible to measure the exact positions, to know the exact positions of the microphones. So there will be also some error in there. So the proposed approach is to use computer simulations to conduct computer simulation of this audio-based bird localization in a reverberant and noisy forest and study the performance and the challenges that may be present in existing sound source localization methods. So we combine forest acoustic simulation and bird sound and background noise dataset preparation and simulating the measurement errors that I just mentioned. And we apply to this virtual forest sound scene recordings these sound localization techniques and look how it would perform. I would like to briefly mention related works on this topic of bird audio localization. And the previous existing works can be roughly categorized into two classes. One group uses densely localized compact microphone arrays, and another group of research use those sparse distributed arrays that we are going to use. And depending on the form of the microphone array, the algorithms that are used will be different. And recently, there have been some work that combine these two approaches. So for each microphone node in the sparse grid, a dense localized grid is used. So in that way, the localization performance could be improved. But in our work, we will focus on the sparse grid, which has monaural microphone nodes, because we're interested in covering a large area of the forest, and using multi-channel nodes would improve the cost significantly. So for the time, we will focus on this simple sparse arrays. So a possible architecture of such a bird monitoring system could look like this. So we have forest and a distributed microphone grid and some birds living in this forest. And there will be a bird activity detector, which detects the activation of the bird sound, and that will trigger the localizer and the bird species classifier. So the biologists are interested in the information, these informations of when and where which kind of bird is active, to compute more higher level information such as the territory of birds and the number of the birds that are living in the forest and that kind of stuff. So these informations are the basic low-level informations. And in our early stage review of related literature, we have found that there's considerable amount of work on this bird activity detection and bird species classification in the recent years, mostly using deep neural networks. And also, even the biologists are training the deep neural networks by themselves nowadays. And we thought that we could potentially contribute, deliver more interesting contribution by focusing on this localization part. So the scope of the project is starts with the forest acoustic simulation. And then we will discuss about the dataset development of the simulated forest sound scenes. And as a third part, we'll discuss the robustness of the sound localization algorithms in this virtual forest sound scenes. Okay, so let's start with the forest acoustic simulation. So the problem of forest acoustics has a long history, and at least date back to the 1940s to the work by Eyring and Foldy. And the aim of these early works was to compute the macroscopic bulk parameter of a forest, such as an effective wave number. And the theory of these early works is really solid. It's very nice. It rigorously takes into account multiple scattering that happens in a forest caused by the tree trunks. But one drawback is that to compress all the microscopic information about the scattering events in a forest, the theory has to rely on statistical averaging, and that will sacrifice basically the microscopic information about the scattering events. And so I thought that using this single bulk parameter of a forest to synthesize forest impulse responses would be a bit too difficult. I mean, it doesn't have the capacity of doing that for arbitrary sound source and receiver positions. So I didn't rely on this work for our simulations. And then there's another line of research in the field of sound effects or digital reverberation synthesis. So there have been two papers, one from 2008 and one from 2017. And both of these works are focusing on modeling the multiple scattering happening in outdoor environments. And that's very nice, but the cost they had to pay is the very high computation cost, which scales in a cubic fashion. So in n cube, where n is the number of trees. So their algorithm, it was nice to take into account multiple scattering, but they're unfortunately limited to very, very small forest. So about 25 or 50 trees or so. So unfortunately, we also couldn't rely on these line of works. So we had to develop our own forest acoustic simulation algorithm. And our approach was to take into account a simple physical model, but doing the computation at large scale. And so the physical effects that we take into account is the scattering by the tree trunks. But the difference with previous methods is that we do it in a first order approximation. So we ignore multiple scattering in our model. This may sound like a oversimplification of the problem. However, it turns out that the resulting impulse responses are quite reasonable. So yeah, that's the story here. And we also take into account air dissipation. And this turned out also to be a very important factor. And so the property of our algorithm is that it scales linearly with respect to the number of trees. So because of this scalability, the simulation of a forest of 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer with 100,000 trees can be easily performed. So here, the forest impulse response model of our algorithm is described. So basically, it has 3 components: the direct signal and the ground reflection component and the tree scattering component. The direct signal is composed by the distance attenuation, which contains a time delay, and the amplitude attenuation, and the air dissipation component. The ground reflection component has, in addition to that, the ground reflection coefficient. And the most interesting part is the tree scattering. And that has the distance attenuation from the source to the trees, and the tree scattering filter, which is dependent on the scattering angle. And then we have the distance attenuation from the tree to the receiver. Here, the delay factor is, the amplitude attenuation factor is included in the scattering filter here. So there is only the delay component described here. Then also we have the air dissipation, which is dependent on the path from source to tree and to receiver. Okay, so next, the tree scattering filter is described like this. And this may look a bit complicated, but it's basically a classical result of theoretical acoustics. You can find it in very old theoretical acoustics papers. But here I introduced 2 parameters that we can potentially use to tune the result, namely this exponent alpha, where rho is here the distance from the tree to the receiver. So in theory, if you consider scattered cylindrical wave, this alpha should be 0.5. But in reality, the trees are not infinitely long cylinders like they are in theory. So I wanted to make this flexible. And also this beta is a parameter that controls the amplitude of the scattered signal. And next, the air dissipation model is, the nice thing about this is it is standardized. So we just use this standardized model and implement it as a finite impulse response filter. Okay, so I would like to present some demos about of these forest impulse responses. So I have here 5 different variations. The first one is a real forest impulse response recorded in a national park in Finland, this nice beautiful forest here. And then we have the synthesized forest reverberation synthesis algorithm from 2008 and from 2017, and 2 of our algorithm with 2 different number of tree densities. So okay, let's start with the real one. So I first play back the impulse responses, and then I play back the impulse responses which are convolved with a dry bird sound. Okay, so this is a real forest impulse response. And this is a 2008 algorithm, 2017 algorithm, and hours with 100,000 trees, and hours with 500,000 trees. Again, the real one.
Shokan.
Yeah.
We cannot hear it.
Oh.
We can, but it's, or I can at least, but it's. I think you have to play the samples for people to appreciate the.
Okay, yeah, I will do. Okay, so do you hear this sound?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, sorry, maybe the impulse, the head of the impulse response wasn't played back. I don't know. Maybe it's because of PowerPoint. But so anyway, so okay, let's listen to the bird sound. So this is a dry bird sound. This is the real forest. A 2008 algorithm. A 2017 algorithm. Hours with 100,000 trees. Oh, sorry. Hours with 500,000 trees. And again, the real one. Okay, so I think it demonstrates that our algorithm at least works. It doesn't produce some any useless impulse response, and it's actually quite reasonable. And one comment on the performance. So the algorithm by Spratt et al. From 2008 has a MATLAB open source implementation, and we computed impulse response for a forest of 50 trees and computing up to second order scattering, and that took about 31 minutes to synthesize a single forest impulse response. And in contrast to that, our algorithm was able to compute a single forest impulse response for a forest of 100,000 trees in just 1.3 seconds. So it's significantly faster and efficient. Oh, sorry. Okay, so next we evaluated these forest impulse responses using a quantitative measure, which is the echo density. I don't go into the detail of this metric, but it basically measures the density of the echo spikes in a sliding window fashion. So it gives you the temporal profile of the echo density. And some typical room impulse responses have these kind of density profiles, so they grow and saturate at a constant value. And here are the echo densities for some of these forest impulse responses. So the red one is the 2008 algorithm, 2017 algorithm is this yellow one, and ours with 500,000 trees is this green one, and the real recordings from the Collie National Park is the blue one. So what we can see here first is that real forest impulse responses tend to have this flat profile. So from the very beginning of the impulse response, it has this almost constant echo density, and we observe this in basically all of the Collie recordings. There are 10 or maybe 20 or so provided and publicly available, and that almost constant profile is not observed in the previous algorithms, but can be observed in our algorithm with many trees. So if we reduce the trees in our algorithm, we lose this constant profile, and we have this more similar pattern like this. So initially it has a smaller value, but so by adding enough trees, we get this realistic profile. Okay, so and one last component of the forest simulation is the integration of the sound source directivity. So birds, we're interested in birds, and birds will have some kind of directivity of the radiation. And we approximate this by using a theoretical model here. We approximate the bird's head with a sphere and assume here a point source mounted on the sphere surface. And this is also a well-known problem in theoretical acoustics, and the result can be easily computed. Okay, so yeah, this was the last part on the forest impulse response simulation. Yeah.
What is the diameter of the sphere?
Okay, so here we just use a constant value. I think it was 2.5 centimeters or so around that, or maybe 5
so
centimeters.
roughly the diameter of the head.
Yeah, of the bird, of our average bird head.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so next I'll briefly talk about the sound scene dataset creation. So we have used two famous bird audio databases, which is the Macaulay master set and the Zeno-Canto database. So this Macaulay master set is a subset of a much larger dataset, which is known as the Macaulay library dataset. And also the Zeno-Canto dataset itself is a massive dataset that has more than a few 100,000 bird sound clips, but we use just a subset of that. So we have extracted using a general purpose voice activity detector clean bird clips, roughly 1,000 from both of the data sets, and 2,000 noise clips from the Macaulay set and 40,000 noise clips from the Zeno-Canto data set. So this number roughly tells you how noisy this Zeno-Canto data set is. And actually what we heard from the our collaborating biologists is that the Macaulay master set is one of the cleanest and Zeno-Canto is one of the messiest. So it's nice to have this contrast here. I just play back here some examples. This is a clean bird clip. And from the Zeno-Canto set. And an example noise clip. And for each of the extracted noise clips, we also generate stationary noise clips that have the same spectral shape. Okay, and here's another noise clip from the Zeno-Canto dataset. And the stationary version of that. So these noise clips are extracted from these field recordings of bird sounds. So it is they kind of mimic the reality. And we implemented a script that randomly generates forest sound seeds using the database of bird clips and noise clips and the forest impulse responses that we simulate. And that saves the audio clip in metadata, which contains all the labels and ground truth information about the sound scene. And here's an example sound scene, which is 6 seconds long and has 10 bird chirps. And the same sound scene recorded at a different position in the virtual forest is this. Oh. Oops. Sorry, what happened? Oh. Okay. I play back again the first one. So I guess you have recognized the contrast depending on the microphone position. Oh. Okay, and as one last component of the sound scene simulations, we integrate simulated wind noise. So there's a nice paper from 2018 which describes a method to simulate wind noise. And here I just use playback here an example. Okay, so it sounds quite reasonable, and we use this as an additional noise source in our experiments. Okay, so the last part is about the sound source localization experiments. So I briefly introduce the basics of the sound source localization techniques that we are using here, which are called time delay estimation methods. So the idea is simple. If you have two microphones and a sound source and record the signal, you would receive the sound wave at different timings, depending on the distance of the sound source and the microphones. And so the idea is to compute the cross correlation function between these two microphone signals, and that would give you a spike at the time which is corresponding to the time difference of arrival. And so identifying that spike means that we can identify the hyperboloid of that specific time delay of arrival, and which serves as a hint of the sound source position. So if you only have two microphones, you can only get this single hyperboloid, but if you add more microphones, you get multiple hyperboloids. And the point that intersects all the hyperboloids intersect is basically the position of the sound source. And to do this robustly, usually we compute a function which is called a spatial likelihood function. So for each of the possible points, we compute the likelihood of the sound source to be there, and we aggregate that for all the microphone pairs that are present in the array. And these kind of methods are called generalized cross correlation methods. And the generalized means here that we apply here a spectral weighting function in the computation of the cross correlation. So before going back, so the computation is usually done in the spectral domain. And before going back to the time domain, we apply a spectral filter here. Okay, so in our experiments, we compare two of these GCC algorithms. The one is GCC FAT, and the second one is GCC Roth. There are many more variants of these GCC algorithms, but here we focus on the very simple ones, because the more sophisticated functions require either a priori knowledge of the signal and noise spectrum or online estimation of those information, and it would complicate the signal processing pipeline a little bit. And here we wanted to focus on the basic algorithms, also because this GCC FAT algorithm is also very widely used, also by the bioacoustics people. So we focus on these algorithms here. And to accelerate the experiments at larger scale, we run the experiments on the GPU. So in the largest case in our experiments, we consider a microphone grid which covers a forest of 400 meters by 400 meters. And we have a spatial resolution of 20 centimeter. And that means we have 2000 by 2000 possible sound source positions. And that computation can be a little bit expensive, but can be very efficiently parallelized on the GPU. So we do this optimization here. Oh, by the way, this is one example of the spatial likelihood function. So you usually see these traces of the hyperboloids that I just mentioned, and the point where all the hyperboloids intersect gives you the bright spot, which is likely to be the sound source position. Okay, so before going to the experiments, so here I would like to explain some of the assumptions that we make here. So we assume that we have this kind of system. We particularly assume that we have a robust bird activity detector as a preprocessor, so which robustly reports the microphone that is closest to the bird. And we use the 9 microphones, the 3x3 grid of microphones that is containing the bird in our experiments. So basically we do this, this assumption is made in order to reduce the computation cost. In our largest case, as I mentioned, we have a 400 meter by 400 meter grid. But the forest can be much larger. And to reduce the search space in the localization algorithm, we made this assumption here. Now I would like to explain about the first experiment. So the first experiment is an exhaustive study of all the variables that we have. So we have 9 variables here. The first one is source position. For the source position, we use 100 randomly selected positions within the microphone grid. And basically we use these 100 positions to average the results. And for the microphone spacing, we have 4 choices from 25 meter to 200 meter. Oh, by the way, microphone spacing is this distant D here. For the microphone grid type, we have 5 choices. So in the very ideal case, we have a completely regular Cartesian grid like this image shows at the recording stage and also at the localization stage. But in reality, we don't have access to the exact microphone positions. So here we assume some microphone position error and use a perturbed grid at the localization stage. But also in reality, it's also not possible to place a microphone at these kind of exact Cartesian grid positions, because if you have a river in the forest or if you have rocks in the forest, you cannot place the microphones there. So in reality, it would be a perturbed grid at the recording stage. And for the localization stage, we have here 3 choices: either the regular Cartesian grid or the exact perturbed grid or another perturbed grid. So this last one is the most realistic case. And for the tree density, we have either no trees or 10,000 trees per square kilometer or 100,000 trees per square kilometer. For directivity, we have the on-off switch. So on would mean the directional bird directivity, and off would be the omnidirectional case. And for the noise types, we have 10 different choices. So either clean, so no additive noise, or we use the shaped stationary noise that I have played back before, or the extracted noise clips, or the wind noise. And for each of this noise category, we have 3 different levels from 40 dBA to 60 dBA. So for synchronization error, we have also the on-off switch. And in the case of on, we apply a random synchronization error to each of the microphone channels independently, sampled from the uniform distribution from -1 millisecond to +1 millisecond. For the GCC weighting function, we have the FAT and the Roth function. And for the datasets, we have the 2 Macaulay and Zeno-Cantor datasets. So if we multiply these numbers, we get 960,000 combinations, which is close to 1 million. So it was very essential to run the experiments on the GPU, especially in the large grid cases. Okay, so before describing the results, I would like to explain what kind of metrics, evaluation metrics we use. And for that, here, the histogram of the localization errors is plotted. So what we usually observe as a result is we have many experiments where the localization error is very small. But then we have this long tail of almost random localization error results. So it's natural to categorize this into success and fail. And basically, we use this success rate, the probability of success, as the evaluation metric in the next couple of slides. And for the threshold here, we use 5 meters. So if the localization error is smaller than 5 meters, then we treat it as success. This matches with this histogram that we get here, but it also is based on the insights from the biologists. So what our collaborators told us is that they're interested in computing the territories of the birds, and for that purpose, up 5 to 10 meters would be sufficient for the localization accuracy. So we also incorporate that knowledge here. As I mentioned, we have this 9-dimensional explanatory variable space, and so visualizing the result of this 9-dimensional space is a bit tricky. So we, in order to compress the results, we have looked at the standard deviation of the success variable. So success variable is the binary probabilistic variable, which also 1 means success and 0 means fail. And if you look at the success standard deviation for each of the variables, we get this. So we find that the microphone spacing and the noise type and the GCC algorithm choice has a significant impact here. And the other variables are relatively small. And to give you some numbers, we observe that the presence of source directivity drops the average success rate by 9.3%. The application of synchronization error drops the result by 1.8%, and the presence of microphone position error drops the result in average by 7.8%. And the GCC FAT algorithm outperformed the GCC Roth by 20% in average success rate, which is quite significant. So to reduce the variable space, we first select the realistic scenario here. So we take the results for the directivity on, synchronization error is on, and microphone grid is the most realistic one. And we select the GCC FAT algorithm. And the number of trees had a relatively small variance here. So we average out the results for the cases which are realistic, so which had trees, excluding the case without trees. And also the source positions and data sets these dimensions are used to average the results. And so we end up with a 2-dimensional variable space now, which is trivial to visualize, which is summarized here. So in the x-axis, we have the noise type, and y-axis, we have the microphone spacing. And what we see here is that the general trend is that if we increase the microphone spacing, we lose localization accuracy, or the success rate of the localization error, success rate of the localization. And also if we increase the noise level, we lose the success rate. So basically that's a reasonable result. But it implies some things here. So the results tell us that the SNR, signal to noise ratio, is important, and the spectral weighting function in the GCC algorithm has a significant impact on the results. So this led us to 2 ideas to improve the performance of the localization algorithm. Of this source localization. So the first idea is to apply a problem-specific spectral weighting, which is just simply a band limiting in our case. So actually, so far we haven't utilized the fact that the things that we are trying to localize are birds. And so here we incorporate a very simple domain knowledge that bird vocalization is mostly contained in the spectral range of 1 kilohertz to 8 kilohertz, and apply that band limiting here in the GCC algorithm. And the second idea is to improve the SNR. So we apply noise reduction here as pre-processing. And in particular, we use the MMSE SDSA noise suppressor here, which is applied independently on each of the microphone channels. And that gives us these results. So in the left top, we have the baseline result. in the left right top, we have the result with the band limiting applied, which improves the average success rate by 9%. And if we add noise reduction only, we get this 7.8% average improvement. And if we apply both of these techniques, we boost the success rate by 14.4%. And this is may sound obvious, but the result is actually very encouraging, because if we have a look at the moderate noise levels, and at the, for example, the microphone spacing of 100 meters, initially we had only about 50% success rate here, but after these improvements, we have 70 to 75% success rate. So that means, so initially this 100-meter spacing seemed to be useless, kind of, but it actually turned out that it can be useful and practical for applications.
And Shokin,
Mm-hmm.
if I may, just to give people a point of reference,
Mm-hmm.
I went to, for those of you who live in the Seattle area, I went to Volunteer Park, which is a pretty popular park here in Seattle, and I recorded ambient noise in the evening with people walking around, with airplanes flying overhead, and it was around 50 dBA. So it would correspond to roughly the moderate noise level that Shokin is showing here with W50, S50, and C50.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you very much, Hannes. And okay, so, and this is now another visualization of the results. So in the x-axis now, we have the mean signal-to-noise ratio. So the average is taken over the microphone channels that are used. And also one thing that I should mention is that this SNR is nothing estimated, but the exact SNR, because we are generating our sound scenes by ourselves. We have access to the exact ground truth values for these numbers. So in the y-axis is again the success rate, and this blue chain line is the baseline, and the yellow chain line is the result with band limiting applied, and the solid lines are with the band limiting and noise reduction applied. And so, and here I tried several different noise reduction algorithms, but that difference was relatively small. But what we again see here is that for the same average SNR, especially in this intermediate region, we get a boost of about 20% of success rate. Or if you look at horizontally, for the same success rate, we can have about 10 dB more noise. So this is an encouraging result, but it also provides suggestions for future improvements. So so far we have only incorporated minimal information or minimal domain knowledge about birds. But I would suggest to do that more. So to integrate a machine learning-based bird sound extractor or suppressor can be utilized to do the separation or estimation of the signal and noise more accurately. And there are GCC algorithms that can utilize this knowledge, and that would improve the result of localization algorithm. And also, we can utilize the domain knowledge about bird vocalization frequency spectra by utilizing the output of the bird species classifier. Here, so if we know the bird species or the type of vocalization of the birds, the biologists have the knowledge about this species-dependent bird vocalization spectrum, so that can be used as an additional weighting function here for the localization. With that, I will conclude my talk. So we have developed efficient forest acoustic simulation algorithm, a dataset for bird audio clips and background noise clips, and a forest sound scene generator. And using those, we have studied the robustness and the performance of a widely used sound source localization algorithm in a simulated forest, which contains many kinds of errors and noises. And we have found that the noise type and microphone spacing has a significant impact on this localization accuracy. And with that, we would suggest to integrate the more domain knowledge and real-world statistics about the bird vocalization, which would be very useful to improve the localization performance even more. And also, I would mention that the sound scene generator that we have developed can be effectively used to train these kind of machine learning models. So that's, I think, one promising component of possible future works. Okay, so with that, I would like to end my talk. So we would like to thank Microsoft's Research AI for Earth project for sponsoring this research. We would like to thank Professor Justin Kitces at the University of Pittsburgh for inputs from the biologist perspective. And I personally would like to thank Hannes Gamper for his amazing mentorship. It was really fun working with you. I really enjoyed the project. And I would like to thank Ivan Tashev for having me. And I would like to thank everyone in the audio and acoustics group for the very warm welcome, especially Dimitra for organizing all the fun events and the reading groups. And I would like to thank all other interns in the AAG for sharing their very inspiring works every week. So thank you very much for having me at Microsoft Research this summer. And if you have any questions, I would like to answer.
Thank you very much, Shokan.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there any questions?
So just a general question. This is Ivan Tashev. You have the localization algorithm, and you have this train it on the simulation. Did you do any work on the bird classification and reducing the signal to noise ratio?
No, we haven't integrated any machine learning approach in this project. So that was out of scope.
Okay, thank you.
If I may add to this, basically our thinking here was that there are domain experts that are actively working on the monaural case. So they are training classifiers and maybe even detectors. And it might also be somewhat application specific. So depending on what types of birds or bird species they're interested in, they might train different classifiers. So we felt that the best way to contribute to their work is by sticking with the signal processing aspects and then plugging in whatever pre-trained models the biologists might already have.
I was more interested in a very little aspect of getting one signal, the same sound in this vast microphone array, and what kind of beamforming and enhancement you can do before to feed the mono classifier. But hey, next projects are coming.
So congrats on that nice project. I'm especially interested in a bit more how you implemented those things. So because I know all these models and there are a lot of work. So were there all libraries for those things available, especially these spherical models and cylindrical models, or you implement it all yourself? And as you mentioned, you run it on the GPU.
Yeah, basically I implemented those things by myself. The scattering and radiation filters I implemented by myself, and the localization algorithm by myself. I used open source implementation of this as echo density metric computation, and also I used the open source library for the voice activity detection here. And I don't maybe other ones, but
Cool. So it means you implemented all those spherical models and stuff all yourself.
Yeah.
On a GPU. Nice. That will be of good use.
Yeah.
I can maybe ask a. Oh, sorry. No, somebody else.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay. This is Ben. So I have some question. Before you do the classification of the bird, which you said is oscilloscope, did you like try how to like identify if it's the sound coming from the bird?
Yeah, so that's I guess you're talking about the bird activity detection here. So which classifies if the sound is a bird or not. And there are existing models that do that, but we don't use it in our experiments.
So you took the dataset and try your neural model do this identification. Is that what you say?
No, we don't do any of that identification. So in our experiments, we only generate the sound scenes which are birds. So we assume that we know it's a bird sound that is there, and we try to localize that.
I see. Okay.
So so just to chime in briefly, when we started out, I did. So this is Hannes speaking, by the way. I did briefly try to train a simple machine learning based bird activity detector, or BAD. Bad, yes.
Yeah.
The issue there is that you don't have a very finely labeled data set to train with. So what you get is basically clips that say either bird present or not present. And I think the clips were 10 seconds long. And what we would have been interested in is something more fine-grained than that. So I tried to train a model that would output continuous bird activity detection estimates. But we decided that rather than relying on my hastily implemented suboptimal bird activity detection, let's take that problem out of the equation and just assume that the bird activity detector works as intended. In practice, what might happen is even if you have a bad or no bird activity detector, if you use a very simple metric and just say whenever there's a loud sound at any microphone, use that as a query, run the localization, potentially run noise suppression and or beamforming, and then feed that to a bird classifier. And if the bird classifier says this is a bird or this is a particular bird, then you go back and mark that location as an incident. So if your localization is, if your localization algorithm is efficient enough, you might be able to afford to just run a lot of false positives through your localization algorithm rather than have a very accurate bird activity detector that would weed out a lot of those false positives. That was our thinking, but we'll have to check back with.
Actually a good point. But that leads to me my second question. Like for I understand this this work is based on simulation, but I guess in the future you want to do this in the field. Field experiments. How do you like get ground truths for these bird locations? Do you have any like vision on that?
That's a good question. So what the biologists have done so far is using loudspeakers as virtual birds
for emulations, right?
Yeah, for emulation. So yeah, it's quite tricky to get the real ground truth positions from living birds.
Right.
Yeah. I have no idea.
I guess one option might be if you equip a few birds with a GPS sensor and a microphone, you might get a ground truth location. You might be able to use something like that. But this is still, this is all,
GPS is like a far worse performance than acoustic localization, right?
Right. Yes.
You might want to put a like cage some bird in a room and use Vicon system to do like camera-based localization. That's something.
Yeah.
But as Shokin, as Shokin mentioned, I think the closest is people using loudspeakers in a forest, and that has been done.
I see. And also in the simulation, I see you take the directionalities of the birds into account. But did you also take into the microphone directionality into account? Because I know you probably assume the microphone is omnidirectional, but there's no omnidirectional microphone as well. So probably you want to also that take into account.
Yeah, good point. The answer is no, we haven't taken it into account. We could have done it, but well, yeah. I thought we already took the bird directivity into account, so we could see some kind of effect, how that would affect the result. But you're right. In reality, there would be also some directivity of the microphones.
Right, because if the microphone is directional, you might this might involve mechanically steering the direction of the microphone, make either better or worse performance of your system, I guess. So my last question is about the timing synchronization. You in the beginning of your presentation, I remember you mentioned you're trying to investigate the time error introduced by maybe GPS. And you briefly mentioned that in your results, there's on and off node to turn off on your synchronization. How that exactly affect or impact your results, like time synchronization?
Yeah. So yeah, I just briefly mentioned that in average, I briefly mentioned the average effect here. No, sorry, where it was. Yeah. So actually, it had a quite little drop here in average success rate, only about 2%, which is relatively small. And we use synchronization error, as I mentioned, from -1 millisecond to 1 millisecond, so uniformly sampled from that range.
But do you know how much synchronizing error from GPS that could be?
Yeah. So what our collaborators told us is in a lab condition they achieve about 5 microseconds. So I think our condition is much more strict than it might be in reality. But in some literature, people say that using this GPS clock-based synchronization, the synchronization error could be 1 or 2 milliseconds. So I think the value that we assume is relatively, it's a worst case, kind of.
I see. Because I just did a quick search. I found on Google says the GPS realized like tens of nanoseconds synchronizing accuracy. That's like obvious an overkill for the system, I guess. Okay. Yeah, that's my question. Thanks.
Thank you
nice
very much.
presentation.
Thank you.
And also, can your algorithm tell the difference? Because you said you didn't place microphones by the rivers and things like that. Can it tell the difference between like the sound, a constant steady sound like the sea, like the seashore, and bird calls?
Sorry, I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly, but you're talking about the sound source signal?
Yeah, because you were saying you didn't place microphones by rivers to record the bird sounds. It's kind of limiting the data set. Like you couldn't, for instance, I took from that anyway, that you couldn't place these by the seashore and actually get a lot of seabird noise and those margins.
So sorry, could you? Sorry,
I think the question is. I think the question is, Shoken, that you mentioned briefly at one point that a microphone cannot be placed on a river. But
yeah.
I think so. What Shoken meant is that because of you assume in the localization, you assume that the microphones are relatively evenly spaced or regularly spaced, and if there is some geological feature that might prevent you from being able to do that. It's not a limitation of the method or of the data set. It just means that the position of the microphone might be limited by geological obstacles. But the constant the noise of an ocean or a river should not in theory prevent this method or the localization from working.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry. My loudspeaker was a bit. My earphone was a bit too small. Sorry, I couldn't understand.
Any more questions? Otherwise, I have one generic one.
May I ask one? This is Rico.
Yes.
Yep.
Hi, Hannes. Hi, Shokin.
Oh.
This is very cool work. Back on Van's question on the synchronization, I wonder if you or other researchers did try some active compensation. Let's say you put 4 noise-like sources in the field and then try to calibrate. Would that make sense?
Yeah, maybe. We haven't done that kind of stuff, and I don't know if there's related work on that in the field of this bird activity detection, but yeah, maybe potentially yes, but I'm not sure. I'm not a specialist of this GPS-based synchronization, so sorry, I don't have an answer to that.
That's fine. Okay, thanks.
I don't see any other raised hands. Sorry, Rico, I forgot about that feature. Oh, Dimitra is raising her hand. Go ahead, Dimitra.
No, it's a great feature. Yeah, I forgot about it. So Shokin, this is great work and a lot of work. So if you look at those beautiful success rate plots that you gave us, so in practice you can use that as a rubric metric to decide, given the forest or the situation or the question you're trying to ask as a biologist, you can use this as a metric to decide what parameters to use, how to place your microphones, and what's the wiggle room for everything. Right.
Yeah. So, but of course, before applying this to reality, it should be confirmed by real measurements in real forests, and study how that correlates. But in principle, yes. Yeah.
So the only thing you're missing is real impulse responses.
Yeah, real forests and real birds.
Because the audio you used were real birds, and the noise was also real from the forests.
Yeah.
All right.
Basically, yeah, I should maybe add here the idea originally was to use real recordings, but because of COVID-19, the field recordings had to stop. So the lab that was gearing up to make those measurements, they had to basically postpone their collection. And then we realized that actually doing a proper simulation as well as we can, including simulating the reverb, simulating the noise, the synchronization error, bird directivity and all that, might actually be useful even if you have the chance to go back to the forest and take measurements, because you can probe a much bigger space, both spatially and in terms of the variables, with this approach than you could by if you limit yourself to one particular forest with one type of birds and one category of noise examples you will find there. So it seemed like there's actually value in doing this simulation beyond just the results you're seeing here. Okay, if there are no more questions, I think thank you again, Shokin. It was great having you with us remotely. I did
maybe there's some
job.
last
One more
question.
I see. Yes, go ahead.
Hi. So when I go hiking with my wife, we often notice these birds. I think they're called warblers, and they have a very unique song where they appear to be throwing their voices, and I'm wondering if there's any understanding as to how they appear to do this, or if you've looked at it, or if anyone has looked into this, or if your work could be used to look into this.
Yeah, so we haven't looked at particular bird species, but I guess that our collaborators, the biologists, know very much about those stuff. So yeah, we haven't done much on that specific.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if there are no other questions, then let's thank Shokin again. And
thank you, Shokin.
Thank you very much. Thank you.